Alban, David, all the Celtic ones, all the Northumbrian ones, Augustine coming to Canterbury, Paulinus going to York and baptising Edwin and then having to flee for his life. You know, all those stories are all in that one book. It's a Penguin classic.
Oh, really?
Yes, I know. Not easy to read because it's 7th century style.
Yeah.
But the essence of it's there, and you can extract from it. Hello. You can extract from it all the good stories. So that's what I've been doing month by month.
Hello.
That's another thing that had to be done yesterday. We're live, are we?
Oh, lovely.
And it's just on our football.
It's live and it's working.
I've had a few issues.
Oh, good.
Don't like to say more than that. I'll just go back out to this corridor space.
I think I might bring a chair up here.
Please do.
Just watch the wires when you carry on.
What?
Wires don't trip on the wall.
Well, it's easy to do a little bit further back.
That was wishful thinking. I said, watch the wires, move the chairs. By all means, we do watch the wires. I'm expecting that.
Usually turns up just as we start.
Yeah, just get excited, don't you?
I was just about to nick this chair, but I think maybe you don't.
No,
we're happy.
that is
quick in the
reason,
neck.
because
Come and join us on the
otherwise
end.
they pick on the necks too much.
Oh yes, but hopefully there won't be much up there. I think I've got it here.
Hello again.
Hello, Happy New Year.
Hello, Happy New Year.
The screen.
You're doing the laid back bit.
Oh yes, yes,
Gorgeous pictures this time.
Oh really? Oh right, better. If there's pictures, I like it. Yep. Ooh. Oh, conspicuous. Put it on, just sit down, shut up. Oh.
You make these seats particularly cold.
I'm always cold.
No, but the seats are cold.
Well, I believe the new ones are pending, but I think it probably May time.
Yeah. Just in time for the warm weather. Yes. I think we're gathered. There's 4 of us. Quorum. How about Fridays? And when the bits of the fabric disappeared.
I must say you are a very faithful quartet.
We are. As I say, we're gathered, we're quorum. I could have walked this time.
Just makes all the difference actually. Just to talk, you know, to nobody,
yes,
it must be recorded. It's not quite the same.
5. 6.
Oh, hello, Jane. Happy New Year.
I couldn't see you.
Hello.
I thought there was nobody here.
Oh no, the faithful few are gathered. So the kingdom of Judah.
We're all set and ready to go, just waiting for the word.
Here is the word.
Go.
We're already live.
You're going to count to 5?
No, we're already live.
Pardon?
We're already live.
Well, Happy New Year, everybody, and everybody else. It's a pity in a way that Advent caught up with us a little too early, just before Christmas, And we didn't get this session in before we had the break.
Oh, right.
So this is really the ending of what we were doing last autumn. But I'll give you a recap because it's a long time since we've met. If you remember, we were in the middle of political disaster for Jerusalem. The 18-year-old king, who just about succeeded his father, gave in and surrendered to Babylon, which was the best thing he could have done. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't a tyrant in the way that other people had been, and he merely took the royal family and all their entourage, the chief priests, you know, the top people of society, he merely took them to Babylon in exile and left the rest. In fact, he even found another member of the house of David to become the substitute king, and he was called Zedekiah. And all should have been reasonably well. But, there's always a but, isn't there? Zedekiah turned out to be an absolute weakling. He was given over to his own pleasures. He built himself a new winter palace, thoroughly enjoyed himself at the expense of the people of Jerusalem, who not only had to pay for his new buildings, but also, remember, had to pay the tribute to Babylon for good behaviour. But his friends were the people who he took on as courtiers, and they riled against Babylon and persuaded Zedekiah that he was up the wrong tree. In fact, he ought to put his faith in the king of Egypt, who was much nearer and who'd promised to come and help. And it's that's the point at which we had left it at the end of last autumn. Seven years it took Zedekiah to let the situation in Jerusalem degenerate, still with the promise of help from Egypt wafting in the air. And at long last, his friends got the better of him, and he didn't pay the tribute and waited for the repercussions. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was furious, if you remember, having to come back to the same town the second time when he treated them well the first time. There was going to be no mercy this time. I think that's the theme on which we left it before Christmas. This time he came back himself. He set up his camp at a place called Rev'd and stayed there till Jerusalem really was sliding under the siege into capitulation. They got nearer and nearer to salvation. And so we come to this critical time and start session 22. The date is 587 BCE. The city of Jerusalem was under siege for that second time by the armies of Babylon, and King Zedekiah was this time truly frightened, because he knew that King Nebuchadnezzar would have no mercy this time when it ended. He was desperate. No help appeared from Egypt, so secretly he sent his Ethiopian eunuch to find Jeremiah, who was in prison. He brought Jeremiah to him in the dead of night and asked for his advice. Jeremiah's advice was consistent, as it always had been. He warned Zedekiah there would be no miracle rescue, as had happened before in 701. Do you remember that time of Isaiah when plague had hit the Assyrian army and they'd all gone away? Not this time, said Jeremiah. And all he could do was to advise him to surrender the city to save the lives of the people. And Zedekiah thought again. And he went back to that book that had been found. Do you remember? Which was the essence of Deuteronomy, but not yet quite there. In that book, there was the law that after a certain number of years, every slave had to be freed. Oh, he thought. If I free all the slaves, I shall not only be earning good points with Yahweh, but there will be fewer mouths to feed for the starving owners. Good. The food got shorter and shorter. The slaves were out of business on their own. And then the Egyptian army turned up. Would you believe it? And the siege was temporarily lifted while the Babylonian troops had to turn round and face the Egyptian army. The slaves were very quickly taken back into ownership, and Jeremiah sadly realized how shallow was the commitment to Yahweh's covenant in the heart of the king and the people. But his own faith in Yahweh's covenant was such that he began, even at this desperate state, to develop the hope that in spite of everything, all would somehow work out well eventually. In that lull, while the siege had been lifted, he even went back home to Anathoth, where he'd grown up, and bought a piece of land, an investment for the future. How's that for an act of faith? He'd already written a letter to the people in Babylon, assuring them that Yahweh would rescue them when the time was right. And he was suddenly filled with real optimism for the future. Not only would Yahweh re-establish them all in Jerusalem again one day, but he would also make a new covenant with Israel, a covenant with a big difference. It would not be a set of rules to be kept, like the Ten Commandments, but a bond of love on both sides. And he wrote it is written in the 31st chapter of his book, and I quote, Jeremiah said, "The days are surely coming, says Yahweh, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It will not be like the one that I made with their ancestors, which they broke. And I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And I will forgive their iniquity and remember their sin no more." Let's get rid of that. Well, this proved to be Jeremiah's greatest prophecy. His confidence that when the old had been destroyed and pulled down, a new and better future would be planted and built up again. This is the good thing about Jeremiah, and it was outstanding. This new covenant idea, one of love between Yahweh and the people, instead of, I will do this if you'll do that and keep my rules. But the temporary lull was very short-lived. Do you remember that battle when Egypt and Assyria had beaten each other almost out of existence? Well, Egypt wasn't the force it had been. The Egyptian Pharaoh took one look at the Babylonian army, turned to face him, and he melted away pretty quickly. And in future, he took interest in building ships and establishing a navy on the Red Sea. He took no further interest in Jerusalem, leaving Zedekiah completely in the lurch and helpless. Jeremiah had returned to Jerusalem only to be arrested again. This time he was charged with trying to desert to the Babylonians. The siege of Jerusalem was resumed, and there was no more hope for the city. King Zedekiah was now at his most pitiful state, surrounded by useless and helpless courtiers, and secretly one night again he sent his eunuch to Jeremiah, who was in prison. Jeremiah came and spoke more kindly to him this time, and reminded him that all the popular prophets had been proved wrong, and that Jehoiakim had not returned from Babylon within 2 years as they had forecast. And he again advised Zedekiah, even at this very late stage, to cooperate with Babylon for the sake of the people. Zedekiah almost agreed, and Jeremiah left, sent back to a better prison, but nevertheless back to prison. Zedekiah's courtiers were furious with him, and they demanded Jeremiah's death. And Zedekiah could do nothing to stop them. So they threw Jeremiah into a deep well to drown, except that he didn't. The well was full of mud. It was horrible, but it wasn't deep enough to kill him. Secretly again at night, Zedekiah sent his eunuch to find and save Jeremiah. Well, he found him, but had to get him out of the steep well. He made ropes with old cloths, let them down into the well. Jeremiah tied them underneath his shoulders, and he was hauled up out of the mud. Can you believe it? Can't think what he smelt like, but he was saved. Well, he was saved and sent back to the guards' court. There was only one more meeting, and Jeremiah gave the same advice, but this time Zedekiah admitted he was too afraid to follow it. There was now no more hope for Jerusalem. In 586, when the people were demoralized and starving, the Babylonian siege weapons succeeded in breaching the walls, and they entered Jerusalem. In the confusion, Zedekiah managed to escape and fled towards the river Jordan. Well, he was followed and captured near Jericho and brought back to Nebuchadnezzar himself, who was at Riblah, where Zedekiah was treated as the coward he was. His sons were killed in front of his eyes before he himself was blinded, put in chains, and sent to Babylon to die there unmourned. But Nebuchadnezzar's commands for Jerusalem and its people were carried out by his commander Nebuzaradan. He was given 4 weeks to accomplish it. The temple was stripped and destroyed and its treasures removed. There's a big question here. What happened to the Ark of the Covenant? Well, it was a very ancient wooden box. Did it fall to pieces when they tried to move it? I don't know. It's never mentioned again. It just disappears. You'll hear stories from Ethiopia nowadays that it's turned up there, but I mean, how they managed it, I don't know. It certainly didn't go to Babylon with all the other things. There's just no more mention of it. But the palaces, the houses, and all the other buildings, and a lot more of the walls were demolished. There'll be no more trouble. All the citizens of Jerusalem were rounded up in the same 4 weeks, given time to pack all they wanted to take with them into exile. With all their families, all their possessions that they could carry, the animals they possessed, and all the books and records that they could carry between them. They were marched first to Ramah, where orders came from Nebuchadnezzar to release Jeremiah, in thanks and gratitude for his constant loyalty to Babylon. Jeremiah was given the choice to go to Babylon or to stay behind in the ruins, and Jeremiah chose to stay. The march then continued to Riblah, where Nebuchadnezzar was waiting, and all Zedekiah's courtiers and followers were executed. And then the rest, all the rest, set out on the long one-way journey to Babylon itself. We don't know very much about the administration left behind by Babylon. There are only hints in the chapters 40 to 45 at the end of Jeremiah's book. It seems that at first, Shaphan, do you remember him? One of the great people in the temple who'd taken care of Jeremiah. His grandson Gedaliah was left behind as a governor, not a king, a governor. But he was soon murdered. And the murderers fled to Egypt, and they forced Jeremiah to go with them. And there, eventually, this sad and very lonely prophet died. We don't know how, when, or where. Jerusalem was left empty. The walls were in ruins, the temple was gone, the treasures had been looted, and the dynasty of David had come to an end. Archaeologists have confirmed all the massive destruction of this time, not only around Jerusalem, but also in the major cities of Judah as well. But life goes on. In fact, it was only the citizens of Jerusalem that were deported, with the rest of the priestly families, the aristocrats, all the top educated and professional people, all the artisans, and many others, many of the middle classes in Judean society. The rest remained, but under very strict Babylonian control this time. No civilians were appointed to leadership roles, so the people who remained continued to live in a state of acute depression, sad economic poverty, and political inactivity. The year 586 was a watershed in Israel's story. Nothing would ever be the same again. Except that gradually, over the next few years, some of those who had not been deported began to move into the ruins and into the ruined houses of Jerusalem, which they sort of rebuilt. They were virtually left there, undisturbed, for the next 50 years. So generations are going to settle in to the ruins of Jerusalem. And the question arises, where would the Jewish faith begin to flourish again? In Egypt or in Babylon? Egypt looked the most likely of the two to start with, because many Jews had fled to Egypt years ago and found welcome. Possibly they'd gone in the long reign of King Manasseh, but they'd been drafted into the Egyptian border forces, mainly in the south at Elephantine, near Aswan. They even had their own temple there, where they worshipped their god Yahweh. They kept the Sabbaths, the festivals, and even Passover. So Egypt looked very positive. But over time, it gradually was disintegrated and became part of the Egyptian pantheon of gods and goddesses. Yahweh acquired a female goddess for his partner, and that virtually was the end. It disappeared from history. So the future lay in Babylon. Now, let's get some pictures. Well, one picture. The long trek. And it was a long trek. You can envisage that map, which I haven't bothered to put up for you again. They had to travel from Jerusalem northwards from your direction, round the Fertile Crescent, as far as the river Euphrates, and then southwards. And they got to Babylon. If they'd gone further, of course, they'd gone back down towards the Persian Gulf and Ur of the Chaldees, where Abraham had come from. So that's the circular journey they were making at this point. And it was a rag-and-taggle gypsy-like procession, struggling along with the elderly, the youngsters, the babes in arms, their possessions, everything that they could carry. It was a long trek, and full of uncertainty, even though they knew that King Jehoiakim was still in Babylon, living and eating at Nebuchadnezzar's expense at his own table. Oh, where, no doubt, he was kept under constant supervision. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't stupid. He kept the king firmly under his observation. But what would life be for these exiles? Psalm 137 expresses their despair. I'm sure you'll recognize it when I begin to quote. By the rivers of Babylon we sat down and wept. When we remembered Zion, we hung up our harps on the willows there. They just said, how can we sing Yahweh's song in a foreign land? They felt cut off, abandoned, and the end of the Psalm 137 expresses all their wishes for revenge on Babylon. The first shock, however, was the city of Babylon itself. Top citizens of Judah, and what had been proud people, suddenly felt like country bumpkins going to town. Let's have a look. So what did they find? That was the gate of the city. That has been reconstructed from the original remnants in the museum at Leipzig by the archaeologists who excavated it all. It is huge, as you can see. The next one shows you the colouring of it, at least I hope it does. It's bright blue and decorated with animals all over. And the bright blue are tiles, glazed tiles, which must have shone in the sunshine. Fantastically beautiful and very imposing. And those little animals are all in the tiles. You can see the lion, you can see the blue tiles behind him, and there's another pair of them walking along behind. That was the gate. It was called the Ishtar Gate, and it was not only a gate, but of course a great temple to the goddess Ishtar. Well, that's what confronted them. Now, beyond this gate, there was a 3-mile-long, straight, paved road. The processional road leading to the main temple dedicated to the city's god Marduk at the far end. Let's have a look at that. That's looking backwards. You can see the blue gate in the background, and that road, paved, which is very unusual for streets, but paved so that processions could take place. From the temple at Marduk to the temple of Ishtar, and that was 3 miles long. Can I remind you that the processional route in London, the Mall, is 1 mile long? This was 3 miles long. And also, at the far end, the end you can't see at the moment, was the new palace which Nebuchadnezzar had built for his wife. Do you remember the Hanging Gardens of Babylon? Mm-hmm. That was it, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar had built it for his wife, who'd come from another part of the world where there were mountains, and she missed the hills. So he built a palace with a hill for her beside the river. And that reminded her of her childhood. And that palace on its own would have put Buckingham Palace into the realms of a mere country house. It was fabulous. Well, let's have a look. The new palace. There you can see the river in front with its bridge going into the city. You've got the temple on the left, and beyond the temple, going right into the distance, is that long processional route, going from the temple to the gate that you can't now see because it's too far away. You got all that? And the temple of Marduk, god of the city of Babylon, should, I think, be familiar to you. Going right back to the first time we ever met, and I introduced you to the temple of Ur, where Abraham lived. And that type of temple is called a ziggurat. And on top of the old, it is, because you see, they always believed that gods lived in the sky. So they had to build as far up as they possibly could, or find a mountaintop. But there weren't any mountains down there, so they built the ziggurats instead. A huge temple complex, far outweighing what had happened in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was like a cottage in the sort of one corner of it. It was huge. And we know that because it's, Baghdad is still there. Saddam Hussein built his palace on the ruins of the Hanging Garden Palace. And that straight road is what we hear about in the news today as the international area of Babylon where all the embassies are, all the big houses. It's still there, but very different now from what it was in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. That was the temple of Marduk, and beside it, down that processional way, was his new palace. That's also on the riverfront, as you can see in the background, but a vast construction. Can you see the beginnings of the Hanging Garden? All terraces with trees and shrubs. And on the riverfront, of course, they were allowed to look down. So that was the view that would have been seen from the river of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. It was a magnificent city, far beyond anything that the people from Judah could ever have imagined. But we'll get rid of that now. But then the newcomers began to meet people they'd known before, who'd left Jerusalem 11 years previously, those first exiles, and the senior priestly families in particular. They'd all been living and hoping to go back to Jerusalem and the temple, but their hopes too were now dashed. There was no temple. So now all of them felt abandoned, well and truly beyond the influence of Yahweh. Other people, however, assured the newcomers that life in Babylon was not that bad. In fact, it offered many opportunities for enterprising people. So not all doom and gloom. But it was a culture shock of bewilderment. And so too was their treatment. They were not treated like slaves who'd been captured. In fact, their artisans were all employed with Nebuchadnezzar's building programs. All the artists were employed. But the whole community was given a large area of land in the suburbs of Babylon, near the tributary rivers of the Euphrates, the rivers Habor and Kibar. And there they were told to establish themselves positively. They were allowed to build homes, etc., for themselves, and they looked after themselves. They had autonomous rule over their own community. So it wasn't too bad. They were allowed to pursue their own interests, even to setting up successful commercial enterprises. And many of these prospered over time, and in time the families became more and more wealthy. It wasn't a bad life. They became more and more wealthy, more settled, and rich. That is, apart from the priestly families, who knew they could not worship their God with sacrifices because there was no temple anymore. That law, the law of the single sanctuary that King Josiah had passed, had very, very deep impact on all the people. So imagine, even these first exiles had a big and bewildering surprise. Because before the arrival of the newcomers, they'd all poured scorn on a young lad in one of the priestly families called Ezekiel, who claimed he was a prophet of Yahweh. Ridiculous, impossible, they had said, and they took no notice of him. In fact, they laughed. But then they began to remember that he had told them that Jerusalem under Zedekiah was doomed for destruction. They'd laughed at him. But now, well, what? If? And the question marks began to arise. Well, Ezekiel had been proved right by the disaster of 586. So, could he be? Was he a true prophet? More question marks. If so, did it mean that Yahweh had come with them to Babylon? Lots more question marks. Was it possible that Yahweh was not confined by geographical borders? Ooh, what a big idea. And then they remembered that it was not in Jerusalem that Yahweh had first revealed himself to Moses. It had been at Mount Sinai, far away from it, and in the desert. And suddenly a mysterious hope began to arise again in their hearts. Had Yahweh come with them to Babylon? Well, we should continue this next time. The family elders regained their importance in the society as they began to retrace their family genealogies for future reference when they went back home to Jerusalem. And the priestly families began to collect and put into writing all their ancient customs and liturgies. We have the beginnings of the book of Leviticus. And the prophetic guilds, those groups that followed the teachings of the major prophets that had collected all their little poems. We call them guilds, but I don't think they called themselves guild. But they were group followers of the great prophets. They began to finish the book of Deuteronomy. They got the core, and they started putting stories around it and emphasizing its teaching. So they were all busy. Not only that, they had taken all their records with them, the political records, and they began writing what we call the Deuteronomic histories. And if you remember, in the history of Israel, the northern kingdom, every king had been denounced, but he sinned according to the sin of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who set up the golden calves, not worshipped in Jerusalem. And that sort of stamp goes all the way through the historical records, all through the two books of Samuel and the 2 books of Kings. And they're lumped together in textbooks as the Deuteronomic history books. All that was being done in Babylon. But the big question was, how were they now to make contact with Yahweh? And how could they possibly worship him with no temple? Life was certainly very different after 586. There'd be no turning back, only a very different way forward. And that's where we're going to leave it. As I say, it was a rounding off of what we did before Christmas, and next time we set off on this new track when life would never be the same again, and they had to find out how Yahweh really was with them and what it meant. So, hope to meet you in a fortnight's time, and goodbye for now.
Put it in his phone.